I think Islam hates us.
They have done nothing except wreak havoc and terror for our faith and our religion.
When we stand up to those who oppress our communities, that Allah accepts from us that as a form of jihad.
Foundations of society are fragile. We must be the shepherds of our own civilization.
Anyone answers either yes or no without making necessary distinctions, both are not telling the truth. They're lying.
Father, we pray that your word will become a hammer that breaks rocks into pieces. That you will raise up in this nation pulpits and prophets that will call the nation back to repentance.
Will you distance yourself from those who think differently, or will you join us at the table and talk about what is really important? This is the Al-Ma'idah Initiative, conversation without compromise.
So I actually think you're a part of my involvement in sort of getting to know the Muslim community, because I'm pretty sure one of the moves that launched me into this was an interfaith event you may have set up but weren't able to attend, and then that ended up in the whole Muslim Student Association inviting themselves to my church.
Yeah.
And so our paths actually go back a long way, but we haven't sat down and talked until recently. And really our paths have crossed through exploring this Uyghur issue. So tell me how you really got involved in all this.
Right. Thanks, James. And I remember that time when we met up at UW, University of Washington, 6-7 years ago. That was excellent. We have to go way back to the 1980s, when my wife and I, Julie, first went to the Uyghurs. We were part of the evangelical missionary movement, and we wanted to go to a way, way out there place. And we heard God call us to China. And then we lived in Taiwan for a couple years, studying Mandarin. We're interning at a Chinese church. They were incredibly kind to us. I was completely out of money, and the church passed the hat and sent me up to Northwest China, where I had a friend in Lanzhou province. And it was on that trip I first heard about the Uyghurs. And I ended up applying for a job the next year at Xinjiang University, which is the main university in the Uyghur Autonomous Region up in the Northwest. Ended up getting a job and moving there with my family in 1985. And that began a 5-year run of teaching first 2 years at the main, in the main capital city, Urumqi. And then we moved out to provincial or more rural area on the Soviet border, a city called Ili or Gulja, and taught for 3 years at a teacher's college. And so we had 2 kids at that time. And out in Ili, the people did not like to speak Mandarin, and it really forced us to learn Uyghur, which we were delighted to do. So we had tutors, and I'd go exploring neighborhoods and practicing what I knew. And then 1990, moved to Seattle to start graduate school, and start studying the Uyghurs in a different way through a 9-year PhD program, focused on an ethnography on Uyghur families. So I better stop there.
So when what was the relationship between the Uyghurs and the Chinese government like back in the 80s?
So back in the 80s was a bit of a golden time in terms of the government had the constant refrain was Minzu Tuanjie, which was coming together, hospitality between the ethnic groups. And it was a time of Uyghur language publishing, in many ways flourishing. Journals, newspapers were flourishing. Authors, poets, novelists were able to get their books published. At that time, there was Uyghur language instruction in the schools, and something called a Chiefangguan in Mandarin. All the university graduates of all the ethnic groups had government jobs, and so remember the Cultural Revolution really didn't end until the late 70s, and so by the time we got there, it was just maybe 5-6 years into the regular running of universities, admitting students taking exams, having a higher standard. So when we first got to Xinjiang University in 1985, our first, for 1 year, we taught all teachers. And there was a mix of Uyghur and Kazakh and Han teachers improving their English. And many of those teachers then were the best and the brightest, who then were sent abroad to study in Japan, Europe, United States for advanced degrees.
So is there a specific sort of change point in the ideology of the government between the Cultural Revolution and Mao Zedong, and then what's the regime itself like in the 80s?
Right. So we're talking about the Deng Xiaoping era. And he has a famous phrase, Hei Mao, Bai Mao, Jineng Zhuo Lao Su Zhi Hao Mao. And I hope your listeners will forgive that lapse into Chinese, but it's essentially, it doesn't matter if it's a white cat or a black cat. If it can catch mice, it's a good cat. And so that was the turn towards capitalism, towards open markets, towards the beginning of a rapprochement with the United States in terms of trading, cultural exchange. That's why we were there, because they were open to every college and university wanted foreign English teachers to come and improve the quality of English in their schools. So it was a real exciting time to be there.
So then, at what point do things with the Uyghurs start to shift?
Right. Think of Tiananmen Square incident. So that's at the end of the 1980s. This is when the Chinese government, led in Beijing, Deng Xiaoping was still firmly in command. That's when the government opened fire on its own citizens. And that happened not only in Beijing, but in several other major urban centers across China. And that indicated a darker face. America at that time had something like 50,000 overseas or Chinese nationals here for graduate school. And US Congress granted them all of them an exemption where they could all apply for a green card. And so that was so great hostility between China at that time and the Western nations. So shall I keep going, or?
Yeah. So then, how does that then play into the Uyghur situation? Is that when the shift with the Uyghurs happens, or is that sort of downstream from that?
It's a little bit more downstream. let's say 8 years after Tiananmen, 1997, is the key event in the last 20, well, more than 20 years now, of state violence towards Uyghur people. That was in Olja or Ely, where we lived for those 3 years. So in 1997, there was a cultural movement of Uyghurs around a social institution called a mashrep, where they were gathering for soccer tournaments, improving the cultural standards of their people, highlighting the beautiful oral arts, poetry, storytelling that the Uyghurs are so amazing at. And the government was threatened by that gathering, those types of gatherings, and outlawed them and arrested many of the leaders. And so as parents of these mostly young men who were arrested gathered and protested nonviolently, the government reacted in a violent way, and many were killed. And so from that point on, we began to see incidents of state-backed violence, and then some retaliation by Uyghur people. So there was a spiraling of violent events. Then 4 years later, 9/11 happened, and then that was the U.S.-backed global war on terror. And so the Chinese government took advantage, if we could say, in that sense, and began a harsher climate in Xinjiang towards Uyghur people. On a cultural level, the language policy began to change. The Chinese language was instituted in more and more of the region's schools, and so that eventually through that next decade, and it's resulted in right now where Uyghur language is essentially been pushed to the sidelines in the schools and government institutions. And that's highly representative of the harsh realities of what it's like to be a Uyghur right now.
And so is the main concern of the Chinese government that these sort of these ethnic groups within the country will kind of start to want independence and start kind of breaking up China, or is the concern something different?
Oh, absolutely. So there's an English word called splitism. It's not one that is normally used, but the Chinese government has been, when people get arrested, and of course they've been arrested by we'll eventually get to in our interview the concentration camps, but previous to 2017, when the concentration camps started, when people would get arrested, they would be charged with wanting to split the region off from China. When in reality, the cultural autonomy that the Uyghurs, back to the 1980s, they experienced a high degree of cultural autonomy in terms of their publishing, public arts, concerts. All that began to be curtailed, slowly choked after 9/11 and the increasingly hostile relationship between the state and Uyghur cultural institutions.
So now, how many sort of autonomous cultural regions are there in China? Like how big is this perceived threat? Because you've got sort of the Uyghur autonomous region. We also have things like Tibet as well.
Right.
How fragile does China as a nation look if you start looking at all these individual ethnic groups?
Right, James. Well, for your listeners, the area that we're talking about is a huge area. It's twice the size of Germany. For us, for the American listeners, it's think of the state of Texas and then double it. That's the geographical region. But in terms of security, the area has been highly garrisoned by Chinese troops. There are a series of what are called, let's see, the Chinese term is Bingtuan, and it's army farms. And when the region became independent in 1949, there were 500,000 Republic of Chinese soldiers in the region. So they were all stranded there. So they were recruited by the new communist government to stay. Women from the East Coast were transported, mostly against their will, to be wives. So they formed a whole network of production corps, is in English, but where they were part agriculture, part manufacturing. They're involved in a multitude of different businesses, but including militia, and so they're one part of that security network. And then, of course, regular Chinese army troops. So the region is just ironclad, locked down, and yet the government is nervous. In 1949, the Chinese population, the Han Chinese population of the region, was only 6%, and since then, it has grown exponentially to where they're the largest ethnic group in the region.
So it's almost like the sort of central Chinese authorities almost colonizing this region. Then
that's interesting. You brought up that word. That's the Uyghurs definitely feel, and in the scholarly literature, that this is a colony. This is an internal domestic colony of China. And so a lot of the colonization practices that we've seen in other parts of the world have happened here.
And we don't tend to notice it because it's not one nation colonizing another nation. It's kind of colonization within an existing nation.
Yeah.
So then that seems like a good jumping point then to, you mentioned concentration camps starting in 2017.
Mm-hmm.
What exactly do you mean by that?
Right. Well, that's we have to go back just a few years to give some context to that. The that psycho-violence I mentioned earlier continued, and there were some major. There was 2014. There was, I should go back to 2009. So basically 10 years ago, there were ethnic riots in the streets of Urumqi, the capital city, that were so unfortunate, that were due to a lot of misinformation, due to an incident in a Chinese factory between Uyghur workers and Han workers in Guangzhou, close to Hong Kong. So that resulted in angry Han, angry Uyghurs, violence in the streets that seemed to The police were initially not involved, and then came down quite heavily on the Uyghur population. Many Uyghurs were, young people were arrested at that time. And so a decade plus ago started the kind of the heavier hand. And then in 2016, you mentioned Tibet earlier. So the Communist Party secretary, who Chen Chengguo, who had essentially, with a very heavy hand, repressed the Tibetan Buddhist population of Tibet, was recruited by Xi Jinping to be the Communist Party secretary of the Xinjiang region. And so he came and from the very beginning started a very repressive regime towards locals, which eventually led into the concentration camp era. But remember, it was not perceived. The government did not perceive it that way. It was presented to the world as the re-education camps, re-education policy.
Well, and that's consistent with a communist worldview, right? That you have this idea that a human being is a blank slate, that all of our problems are caused by lack of education. If you just educate someone properly, then all the problems will go away. So if you look at that through a communist framework, then you can kind of justify it to yourself quite easily. Not that you're looking at reality very clearly, but you can certainly find ways to justify it.
And so what has emerged, James, from survivors of those camps, there have been a number of, especially Kazakh citizens who had been lured back into China, were trapped within China's borders and were arrested and put in these camps. A significant number, we have 1.8 million roughly that are incarcerated right now, but several, at least maybe 100, 200 have been able to get out back to their families in Kazakhstan. And they've done extensive interviews with foreign journalists. So we have a clear idea of what goes on in those camps. And you just mentioned the whole idea of what a communist education, but these are the amount of education that happens there seems to be quite limited. People are forced to learn patriotic songs. They're forced to memorize law, legal edicts from the government, and there's the conditions in these camps are horrible. They're according to Chinese government documents themselves, they actually talk about brainwashing, washing the brain, breaking people down psychologically through intimidation, through fear, through beating and torture, and then rebuilding them so that they will essentially be malleable citizens of modern China and fit into the plans of the Chinese government.
As you were saying that, something just hit me about that it's in some ways it's a perversion of the gospel. And here's what I mean. That in the Bible, there's what it means to become a Christian is our old self is crucified with Jesus, and then the new self is born. Now, in the in the Chinese system, the Chinese government functions as God, and it's this dark mirror of this thing where they're trying to destroy people so that they can be reborn in the image of this Chinese government. It's this dark perversion of what God does in a way that brings life, but this is a way that brings death. So a question I have about this is there a point that people ever come out of these camps if they feel like they've been sufficiently re-educated, or is this just a death sentence?
No, there's a definite agenda for them when they come out of the camps, and that is to supply labor for factories that have been set up all over the region. And the factories have been set up quite close to these prison camps where ordinary citizens have been. And so they do get some vocational training. And remember, we have to say that many of these inmates in these concentration camps are quite educated people. There are 4 scholars that I'm in particular keeping track of. If I could mention those, these 4 just briefly. The first one is Dilmrat, who's a physics professor at Xinjiang University, married to Uighur, who's a pediatrician. When we were there in the mid '80s, they were our good friends. She looked after our oldest son when he was sick, and he was swept into the camps along with there's roughly 500 professors, intellectual elite, singers, broadcasters, well-known Uyghurs. So one of his colleagues is Tashbolat. Tashbolat was in that first class of students that my wife and I taught. He's one of those remarkable, when you have a student like him, you know, wow, this young man is special. He went on to Japan, earned a PhD in geography, has since published in peer-reviewed journals all over the world, has an honorary doctorate from the Sorbonne in Paris. And so we knew his wife, we knew his parents, visited his parents' home in Ely. He was arrested at the Beijing airport on his way to an international conference. He and Dilmrat, the 2 of them, were given death sentences. And we still don't know whether they're alive or dead.
And what is it? Yeah. And so what is the Chinese government charging them with that they're justifying a death sentence?
Right. Promoting independence. So it's that standard charge. It's like a rubber stamp of wanting to split the region off from China, promoting terrorism. But when you actually look at the lives, everyone who knows Tashbolat in particular, Communist Party member, he rose to become the president of Xinjiang University. So he was the highest ranking educational official in terms of his academic status. Loyal party member. He was taken into that camp. So it just shows that part of the reign of terror that is happening among the Uyghur community there. No one is safe. If they will arrest the elite members of the Communist Party and accuse them of being what they call two-faced, ikiyüzlük in Uyghur, hypocritical because they aren't sufficiently devoted to the Chinese Communist Party.
So, question here. I'm wondering if this is all top down, or say with the gulags in Russia, for example. One thing that happens is people would widely report on each other, and not always for above board reasons, right? So somebody would like the apartment of somebody else in the building more than their own, and then report this person to the NKVD as a capitalist sympathizer. The NKVD would then interrogate them until they got the answer they wanted, and then deport that person to the gulag. Is that a similar thing happen there, or is it simply just a top down? The government is looking for people it thinks could be trouble and then sentencing them to death, putting them in camps.
Right. As far as I can tell, James, this is a top-down edict. And just an interesting anecdote is that so all over the region, and remember we're talking about thinking again how large this area geographically. So people have quota. One of the famous lines from the central government is round up all those who should be round up, which is about the Vegas directive. So there was a Chinese Han county level leader down in the southern part of the region who began he arrested a certain number, but he began letting people go because the economic activity in his county was being crippled by the number of people that had been incarcerated. And he himself then was actually arrested, kicked out of the party, and imprisoned as a warning to any other government official of being too lenient or promoting the economy before the political correctness in this case of arresting. And just to give you a hint of the scale of this, many of the towns in the southern part of this region have become like ghost towns, where 30 to 40% of the adults have been incarcerated against their will in these camps. And if I could just mention briefly what happens to the children. This is in terms of human rights abuses, this has to be highlighted. And it's something that has really not gotten enough attention. And these children of the incarcerated parents are taken by the government into to boarding schools. And the boarding schools can accept infants from 3, 4, 5 months, babies, tiny babies, all the way up through high school. And they're taken into institutions with barbed wire, with gates, with soldiers guarding them. And the numbers look like to be close to 500,000 children in these government-run boarding schools, where the Uighur language is prohibited. The practice of their religion, most Uyghurs are Muslim, has been prohibited. The US and Canada have come through an era of boarding schools for indigenous peoples. And it's generally acknowledged that those were genocidal, extremely detrimental to the mental health of everyone involved. And the governments have since, Canada more than the US, have acknowledged their part in a very disastrous, large-scale public policy. But that's exactly what's going on at a huge, exponentially larger rate now, as we speak, in Northwest China. So families are grieving, families are mourning. They've been split up. Grandparents have been, they've targeted elderly. One of my friends in DC, Kuzat Altai, he's the head of the Uyghur American Association. His dad was 67, in poor health, taking medication. And he was on the phone with his son, and his last words were, "Son, they're taking me." And so it's hard to imagine that they're arresting senior citizens and depriving an entire people group of their elders, of their storytellers. They're the ones where so much knowledge, especially in the Uyghur tradition, where the elders pass on their cultural knowledge to the younger generations. So it's just part of the scale that we're talking about here.
And so on this scale, right? So what it seems like you're saying here is not that they're not dealing in specific crimes or things against the state. What they're doing is that they're given quotas. You have to round up this many dissidents this month, and they just find people to fill that quota. Yeah. And that's completely consistent with how I've experienced the Chinese airport.
Uh-huh.
I was passing through Shanghai 2 years ago, and the first time I passed through, it was fine, no incident. But the second time, there was a huge line and there's a man crossing it very slowly, and then a young, energetic guy came and started looking at everyone's itineraries. They get too short, you have to leave. Too short, you have to leave. And clearly, what's happened is he's just been told by his boss somewhere, you have to not let this many people into the country today. And then he's just finding any excuse to not let people in. And he let us in, even though our itineraries were shorter than others, because we had a baby for some reason, right? So he had some compassion on us, but it just seemed very arbitrary what was going on there. And that seemed, so it seems like that there's this pretense of separatism and terror that's being used to round enormous amounts of people into camps for the purpose of essentially making a slave labor force.
Yeah. But James, so we should say that there's criteria. Everyone in that part of China has a social report card, and you get graded on this. And this has been rolled out to other parts of China. So, and there's specific algorithms. And for your viewers, in terms of journalism, we should say that the last few months we've had these internal Chinese whistleblowers who have released a treasure trove of documents to the West. So we've been able to identify that earlier question of yours, like, how did they round up close to 2 million people? Well, it turns out there is criteria, and it's and the list can include things like if you're Uyghur, if you're between the ages of 15 and 60, if you traveled abroad, if you have relatives abroad, if you have religious literature on your cell phone, if you've recently been to a religious service, say like a Juma, a Friday prayer. If you don't drink alcohol, that's a check mark against you. If you pray, that's a check mark. And each check mark, it's like you get points. If you hit it's like a grading system. If you hit 60, they just stop counting and come and get you in the middle of the night and take you away. And then you go into the system that we've been talking about. And it's grim. It's very grim. And we just mentioned that the end is these labor camps. And for your listeners and viewers, what we're seeing is that these laborers, as they come out from the concentration camps, are working for factories that are producing some of our iconic brands, like Nike, material for our Costco, Target. Earlier in the fall, there were 1.5 million infant pajamas that were coming to Costco and that were traced. It's the supply chain was traced to labor camps and so there was movement. And so I know we're going to get to this, but it's like, what can we do here in the West in defense, in solidarity for our Uyghur brothers and sisters? Is we can say, I'm not going to buy anything that are produced from these factories where there's a tainted supply chain. So we need to get that information out there.
So here's a question then. Is there a sort of centralized place where all the things that have been documented and proven to come from Uyghur supply chains are kind of documented that people can find them?
Yeah, great question. So in Washington, D.C., there is the preeminent Uyghur human rights organization in the U.S. It's called the Uyghur Human Rights Project. Easy to find. Just type that in Google, and so that has that website has news, information. It's kind of a one-stop place where you can find out about if you, in terms of morality. So you don't want to buy any textiles that have been produced. So you go to that website and then you can interact with the human rights staff there in DC. And I should say that it's most of the funding for this human rights project is through the National Endowment of Democracy, which in turn is funded by the U.S. government. So this is a taxpayer funded nonprofit. So I hope your viewers will check it out.
So that's a pretty great transition point to talk about what the response to this needs to be. So the individual, right, there's certainly a ability there to look at, okay, what products have come out of these concentration camps and avoiding those. Beyond that, what can be done right now?
Again, great question, James. It's raise visibility, like what you're doing on your podcast. I don't doubt that many of your listeners, viewers, have not even heard of the Uyghur people in Northwest China. 12 million, at least, mostly Sunni Muslims, that are now experiencing the biggest crisis of their existence. So they want you to know about them. Before the NBA shut down, I'm a big sports fan, and so there were groups of fans that were passionate about social justice for the Uyghurs that would stand up, and they had on their tummies, like how these guys do, Google Uyghur, just as a way to raise the profile of the Uyghur people. So that's one thing. Another is if you are part of a religious institution like a church, a mosque, a synagogue, is you can invite a Uyghur speaker to, and I know in the coronavirus era, that's hard to do, but this will not last forever. And again, there's so much we can do through webinars, but invite a Uyghur speaker to come and hear stories. We human beings, we are hardwired for stories. And we have a woman right here in Seattle whose mother, Rehila Dao, she is one of those incredible Uyghur scholars, PhD in anthropology, renowned researcher in Uyghur Uyghur culture, specifically their funeral sites. She hasn't seen her mother in 2.5 years, and to hear her speak publicly, of which I have a number of times, about her mom is so deeply moving. And she has a website called Free My Mom. And so if you Google Rehila Dao, you can find that as well. So inviting Uyghurs to come, and then joining networks. There are growing national networks of concerned American citizens, and then this, of course, is beyond national borders, of identifying tainted supply chain, mostly textiles, that are coming into our Walmarts, our Targets, our other major retail outfits, and just refusing to purchase them, and letting those stores know. Because what we're dealing here is deep cynicism on the part of China, that they think we don't care. They think that the Uyghurs are so small, so unimportant, that that they can get away with the worst ethno-religious rounding up of human beings since the Holocaust. So if we are serious about never again, and in early March, just before the coronavirus hit, I think it was March 6th, there was a major event at the U.S. Holocaust Museum, which houses the premier Jewish human rights organization in the U.S. And they specifically said what's happening now with the Chinese government's incarcerating Uyghur citizens is a crime against humanity. So if we take our Jewish brothers and sisters seriously, with the Holocaust in the background, then we essentially need to wake up as a people, as people of faith. I know many of your listeners are Christians, and many of your listeners are Muslims as well. And we hope that there will be a concerted pushback against the cynicism that says that we won't care. We just want cheap prices. We'll, if it's $1 cheaper, we don't care if the supply chain is tainted. No, we refuse to have that kind of attitude. As a people, as a nation, we are better than that. And so as more and more of us can get networked together, we can have an impact.
So with that, right, we're talking about the kind of Christian response to this. What do you think are the barriers that are holding Christians back from engaging this on a wide scale?
Right. Again, a good question. Many, if we can talk about evangelicals, James, for just a minute.
Yeah, let's do that.
Evangelicals have they have an aversion for social diving into the public square. And so this whole aversion of, say, not getting involved in issues that are, quote, political. Though the founder of our movement, Jesus, was a profoundly political person in terms of the socio-cultural era that he was in. So we have to get past this, and I think a lot of on the bright side, a lot of evangelicals are waking up in terms of anti-racism. A lot of Christians are waking up to the idea of that our Black, Brown, Asian brothers and sisters are suffering in this country and need allies. And so reaching out to especially the white evangelical church and saying, do you care? Do you care? And a surprising number of us are saying, yes, we do. And there's points of light that are happening all over this country of Christians waking up to our own nation's racial history, our own history of genocide, and then slavery. So I think as that group of people and waking up as very specifically in terms of following Jesus and being faithful to the call of God on our lives. And so as we move forward in obedience, we see that there are other issues that are in some ways sister issues. And so the whole issue of what's happening among the Uyghurs in Northwest China is an issue of racism. So it's a racist policy for the majority, 94% Han Chinese people. And remember, this is not a Han Chinese people thing. This is a Communist Party policy. But it is a racist policy. And so as we, back to your earlier question, as we wake up to the fact that that we've had racism, and racism is still an issue in our nation, let's keep waking up to that reality. And again, back to storytelling. Let's hear the stories of especially in the church, of Black, Brown, Asian, Indigenous Christians. Let's hear their stories. What's it like for them? And then as we hear these incredible stories, it builds solidarity and concerted action.
So I think in this kind of movement in the church right now, there are things I'm encouraged about and things I'm concerned about as well. So, and I think this applies around the world, because what I think often you see is when in early Christianity, you go from a persecuted minority movement to suddenly having power.
Yeah.
And a lot of the times people have not prepared for that very well. Mm-hmm. So instead of thinking through all of life biblically, they just kind of Christianize the normal ways of doing things, right? So, okay, well, we take down the statues of golden eagles and put up crosses on the buildings. We paint crosses on all the shields of the Roman soldiers and replace the pagan priests with Christian priests and call it good, right?
Yeah.
And so you end up with a kind of Christianization of some unhelpful ideas. So I think that there's good inclinations towards justice in our culture.
Yeah.
But at the same time, if we're not prepared to deal with all of Scripture, we're not going to understand justice properly. And I think right now the church is in a bad place because it's so detached from the Old Testament. If you just read the New Testament and sort of superimpose it onto any type of definition of justice you want, you can kind of get any results you want, right? Including the kinds of things that the Communist Party will do. But if we see justice as something that's objective in the Scriptures, that applies to all of life, and we know the Old Testament, we know the law of God, and we can apply it properly, then we have some ideas of how justice can actually happen, right? Based in impartiality, in truth, in individual human dignity.
So James, you're bringing up that incredible prophetic tradition of in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, of when in the history of the Jews, when they were marginalized especially after the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem at the start of the 6th century, and they moved to the margins of power. That began that larger prophetic tradition of speaking truth to power. And so our larger books of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel began the tradition of really speaking truth to power. And so that's where we need, I'm thinking especially of the Black church, which is traditionally had as one of its roles speaking truth to power. And thinking back to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, which did not get a lot of love from the mainstream churches, especially the white evangelical church. Martin Luther King, remember at that time, was very demonized in public language from powerful people, and yet that the church at that time was doing the prophetic role of speaking truth to power, and then doing something about it by organizing in a nonviolent way. And that in many ways is the beauty of that, of the civil rights movement, of affecting change nonviolently. And just looking at recent movies like Selma by Ava DuVernay, help bring out the tension of, and again, we're back to the Uyghur situation. The Uyghurs don't have guns. They don't have armies. So for them to stand up for justice there and say, here, it has to be done in a nonviolent way. And for us Christians, we have an incredible track record of knowing how to do that, especially as you mentioned, those first 3 centuries before the era of Constantine and Christendom, which happened, say, after 320. Those first 3 centuries as Christians, we were minority on the margins. But as you said, as soon as that transition happened, where we were, as a religious community, allied with the political power structure, that's when a lot of accommodation to the power happened. And we, to use one of Jesus's metaphors, we lost our saltiness. Jesus said we're supposed to be salt and light. And in many ways, this highlights the Chinese church, which we haven't even mentioned. The Chinese church, 80 million, 100 million, huge number, one of the largest groups of Christians on planet Earth right now, could be the largest national church of anywhere on our planet. But they are operating in this modern era of China that we're talking about, very much from the margins. Everything that we've talked about the Uyghurs, the Chinese Christians are experiencing persecution, arrests. They've had to, their underground church has had to even go further underground. Government soldiers and officials have broken up meetings in these last 3-4 years in an unprecedented state. So, so these Christians, James, from both from our margins here in our own country and in China, have a lot to teach the the mainstream church in America. So we need to have ears to listen.
So I think a large problem in this is that there's been a shift in evangelical Christianity to this mindset of the world's going to hell in a handbasket, Jesus coming back soon, so we just kind of got to hunker down and wait for the apocalypse to happen. And people look at something like this and think, okay, but the world's all ending, this is Satan's domain, we just got to stand back and preach the gospel and that's it.
Yeah, well, fortunately, we've got a lot of amazing scholars. One of my favorites is N.T. Wright, back from your home country. And one of the things that that Tom Wright does is show that worldview is profoundly out of step with the biblical text itself. That Revelation 21, 22, the last two chapters of the Bible, talk very clearly about heaven coming down. And there's a whole movement. One of my favorite groups is Evangelicals for Climate Change. It's Young Evangelicals for Climate Change. And so there is a shift in this larger tent of, remember that word evangelical is so big. We just had Christianity Today, the flagship journal, come out in December with their editor-in-chief having this was still at the end of Mr. Trump's impeachment trial, saying that he's not fit to be president. And that created a huge stir. It's really interesting because many people then gave up their subscription, and then many Christians were so encouraged, and other folks, that they subscribed to the magazine. So we hope that it flourishes. But that mindset that you mentioned earlier about, and when I entered in the late 70s, the evangelical movement, that was definitely the presiding worldview of the churches that I was a part of. And but it's becoming minority. So that group, I think, is going to be smaller and smaller and smaller, especially as the young people leave those types of churches by the droves, because they're maybe they're reading their Bibles, maybe they're to this other different interpretation of, if heaven is actually coming down, then we need to take care of this planet. That this planet itself is an organism that is created by our Creator God, that we need to cherish and care for.
Right, but and there's two directions you can go with that as well, right? That you can kind of co-opt that to say, okay, well, I have to support the Green New Deal, and kind of immediately buy into what the sort of popular consensus is on caring for the planet. Or you can take an attitude of caring for the planet and try and kind of go back to the basics and figure out what actually needs to happen. And I see kind of two streams of this kind of awakening, right? That there's one which is moving away from biblical literalism in the way you kind of approach justice issues. Like, people want to take things about social justice and things like that, but they want to move away from other parts of the Bible as well. Yet there's another stream that's happening, is people are taking the Bible more literally, and they realize as they do that, they have to take all of it seriously, not just the things that are pertinent to kind of national success and what's relevant in America, but actually have to take a kind of global view of that. And I think it's a really interesting time to be a Christian right now. And I think more than ever, it's important for us to go back to the text of Scripture look at all of it, not just select parts of it that we're comfortable with, right? And feel uncomfortable sometimes.
Yeah.
Not just.
That's right.
And it's a difficult thing to do.
Yeah.
But it's you don't. But the rabbit, once you start, the rabbit hole keeps going and going and going.
And that's the exciting part, and that we don't need to be afraid. One of the we need to encourage one another to obey the ancient Jewish statement of faith, which is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and then to love your neighbor as yourself. So if we've got that larger framework, that's a lot of freedom to work with. And so we need to encourage exploration, creativity. In this transitional season, as you mentioned, that we're in, and so many of us we're reading, we're studying, we're listening to podcasts like you're doing such a service, James, by getting people on your show and getting ideas out there. So you're right. It's an exciting time, and we're not alone. We're not alone.
But at this juncture, right, whatever your eschatology is, whatever your view is, right, as you said, the most important commands are love God and love your neighbor. And 2 million of our neighbors are in concentration camps being groomed for what's essentially slave labor right now. And it's something we cannot afford to ignore.
That is an excellent summing up. So
if you can just leave us with, if there's one place people should go to continue the research, where would be the best place to start?
Let's see, I've already mentioned the Uighur Human Rights Project, UHRP.com. So just those initials. And another one is Radio Free Asia. Radio Free Asia, again, is a US government funded news organization that has a section on both on China and on the Uyghurs. They are staffed with a brilliant group of 6 to 8 full-time Uyghur-speaking journalists who are producing some amazing articles. And I should mention too that that specifically their relatives, because of their journalistic work, have been targeted by the Chinese government and have been arrested. And you can find that piece that talks about that. So Radio Free Asia, Uyghur Human Rights Project, the BBC, again back from England, is an excellent source of information. If you type in hidden camps, and then another excellent BBC documentary that came out last summer is China, Where Are My Children? So if you type that into the Uncle Google will take you to a great article.
And I think as people get into this, they'll find probably plenty of noise in the issue as well. There'll be people denying this, and to any of those dissenting voices, I think I would say, look at the truth, look at the whole truth, and don't look away, and keep examining things, because the truth will set you free.
Mm-hmm.
So, Bill, thank you so much for being on the show, and thank you guys for listening to the Almeida Initiative podcast. We will be back next week.